Some wounds cut so deep they change the shape of a man's entire life. For 50 years, mountain man Jedediah Thorn has carried the weight of family secrets through the Colorado wilderness, living alone with only his regrets for company. Following an elk trail, the 68-year-old trapper discovers a hidden waterfall. Behind the rushing water lies a cave with a perfectly preserved homestead inside. There are letters, children's toys, and a woman's dress hanging on a wooden peg. But when Jed finds his brother's name carved into the mantle, his world crumbles. The brother he lost to a bitter family feud 50 years ago had been living here all along. What terrible truth had his family been hiding from him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning wind carried the scent of snow across the high peaks, a familiar warning that winter was settling its grip on the Colorado Rockies. Jedediah Thorn stood at the edge of his crude shelter, a lean-to built against a granite outcropping that had served as home for the better part of 2 decades. At 68, his body bore the map of a hard life, shoulders bent from carrying heavy packs across impossible terrain, hands gnarled from setting traps in frozen streams, and eyes that held the peculiar clarity that comes from years of solitude. His weather-worn trapping journal lay open on a flat stone that served as his writing desk, its pages filled with careful notations about game movements, weather patterns, and the gradual changes he'd witnessed in these mountains over nearly 5 decades. The leather cover was cracked and stained, bound with sinew he'd harvested from countless animals. Each entry was written in the same precise hand that had once filled ledgers in his father's ranch office, back when he'd been expected to inherit the family spread down in the valley. The entry from the previous day read simply, "Elk sign, increasing near Devil's Canyon, weather turning. Time to check the high country traps before the heavy snow." No mention of the loneliness that had settled into his bones like arthritis. No record of the dreams that still visited him some nights, dreams of Sunday dinners around a long wooden table, of his mother's voice calling him in from the fields, of his brother Samuel's laughter echoing through the barn. Those memories belonged to another man, another life. The man who lived in these mountains had learned to push such thoughts away like smoke from a dying fire. Jed folded the journal carefully and tucked it into his pack, alongside the essentials that had kept him alive in this unforgiving wilderness. Flint and steel, a bone needle and sinew thread, dried jerky wrapped in oilcloth, and the single-shot rifle that had never failed him when it mattered. His movements were economical, practiced from decades of breaking camp in darkness and cold. The bitter family feud that had driven him to these heights felt like ancient history now, though the wounds still throbbed during the long winter nights. It had started over something so foolish he could barely remember the details, a disagreement about the ranch's future, about whether to sell water rights to the mining companies moving into the valley. His father had supported the sale. Samuel, as the elder son, had agreed. Jed, young and stubborn, had seen it as betraying everything their grandfather had built. The argument had escalated over months, poisoning every conversation around the family table. Words had been spoken that couldn't be taken back, accusations of greed and betrayal, Samuel calling him an idealistic fool who didn't understand the realities of running a ranch, Jed responding with fury about selling out their heritage for mining company gold. The final break had come during a violent thunderstorm in late spring. Jed could still remember the rain drumming against the ranch house windows as he'd packed his few belongings. His father had stood in the doorway, face hard as granite, demanding an apology that Jed's pride wouldn't let him give. Samuel had been there too, silent, his expression caught between anger and something that might have been regret. "You walk out that door, boy, and you don't come back," his father had said, voice steady, despite the emotions crackling through the house like lightning. "This ranch needs men who understand loyalty and family obligation, not dreamers who think they know better than their elders." Jed had shouldered his pack and walked into the storm without looking back. He'd been 23 years old, convinced he was taking a stand for principle. Now, nearly half a century later, he understood he'd been taking a stand for nothing more than stubborn pride, wrapped in the clothes of righteousness. The mountains had taught him many lessons since then, most of them carved into his soul through hardship and solitude. He'd learned that survival required a different kind of strength than he'd ever imagined. Not the physical toughness of ranch work, but a mental resilience that could endure weeks without human contact, that could find purpose in the simple act of staying alive another day. His first winters had nearly killed him. He'd made every mistake a greenhorn could make, following false animal trails, camping in avalanche zones, trusting ice that looked solid but cracked beneath his weight. But the mountains were fair teachers, if harsh ones. They punished mistakes quickly and rewarded learning with survival. Over the years, he'd built a network of seasonal camps scattered across 100 square miles of high country, each location chosen for specific advantages: water access, wind protection, game trails, and escape routes. He moved between them, following patterns he'd developed through trial and error, staying ahead of both weather and the occasional hunting parties that ventured into his territory. The loneliness had been the hardest lesson to master. The mountains provided everything necessary for physical survival: water, game, shelter materials, and medicinal plants. But they offered no cure for the human need for companionship, for conversation, for the simple comfort of another voice responding to your own. Jed had spoken aloud to himself for the first few years, keeping up a running commentary on his activities to fill the endless silence. But gradually, even that had faded. Words seemed unnecessary when the only listener was the wind. He'd learned to read the mountain's moods through subtler signs, the way ravens gathered before storms, how elk moved ahead of pressure changes, the particular quality of silence that preceded avalanches. His hands had grown skilled at tasks he'd never imagined learning. He could skin a deer in darkness by touch alone, repair his equipment with materials scavenged from the wilderness, and predict weather patterns days in advance by reading cloud formations and animal behavior. These skills had kept him alive, but they'd also changed him into something harder and more remote than the young man who'd walked away from the family ranch. The elk trail that had led him to the hidden waterfall yesterday wasn't one he'd followed in years. It wound through terrain he'd avoided since his early days in the mountains, when desperate hunger had driven him to track game through unfamiliar territory. But this autumn had been different. The usual hunting grounds had yielded little game, forcing him to range farther from his established camps. Standing now in the crisp morning air, Jed could still feel the shock of yesterday's discovery reverberating through his chest. Samuel's name carved into that mantle had hit him like a physical blow, shattering the careful wall he'd built around his memories of home. After 50 years of believing his brother had inherited the ranch and lived a comfortable life in the valley, learning that Samuel had somehow ended up in a hidden cave homestead defied everything Jed thought he knew about his family's story. The questions multiplied like ripples in still water. When had Samuel left the ranch? Why had he come to these mountains? How long had he lived in that cave? And why had he chosen such isolation when he could have returned to the comfort of family and prosperity? Most troubling of all, why had Jed never encountered any sign of his brother during all these decades of ranging through the high country? The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke that made Jed's pulse quicken before he remembered the dead ashes in the cave homestead's fireplace. No one had tended a fire there for years, maybe decades. Whatever story that hidden home contained had already reached its conclusion, leaving only artifacts and questions behind. Jed secured his pack and began walking toward the distant waterfall, his moccasined feet finding purchase on the rocky trail with the unconscious skill of long practice. Each step carried him closer to answers he wasn't sure he wanted to find, but couldn't resist seeking. The mountains had taught him many things about survival and solitude, but they'd never taught him how to walk away from family mysteries that called to him like distant voices on the wind. The trail ahead wound through stands of aspen, already stripped bare by autumn winds, their white trunks stark against the evergreen slopes above. Somewhere in those peaks, hidden behind falling water, waited the preserved remnants of a life he'd never known his brother had lived. Whatever truths lay waiting in that cave would either heal the wounds of 5 decades or tear them open wider than ever before. But Jed had learned long ago that some trails had to be followed to their end, regardless of where they might lead. The waterfall thundered down from the granite ledge above, its mist creating rainbows in the barns. Late morning sunlight that filtered through the canyon walls. Jed approached the cascade with the same careful attention he gave to all unfamiliar terrain, noting the slick rocks, the depth of the pool below, and the peculiar way the water seemed to disappear behind a curtain of stone rather than spreading naturally across the cliff face. He'd passed this way only twice before, both times many years ago when tracking wounded game had forced him into this remote section of the high country. The waterfall had registered then as nothing more than a landmark, a source of fresh water in a landscape that hoarded such treasures jealously. But yesterday's pursuit of the elk herd had brought him close enough to notice something he'd missed during those earlier visits, a narrow gap between the falling water and the rock face behind it. The discovery of that hidden entrance had changed everything. Now, standing before the waterfall with his heart hammering against his ribs, Jed could barely comprehend what he'd found in the concealed space beyond. He'd entered, expecting nothing more than a shallow cave, perhaps a place to shelter if the weather turned violent. Instead, he'd stepped into what could only be described as a preserved homestead, frozen in time like an insect caught in amber. Taking a deep breath of the cold, mist-laden air, Jed ducked behind the waterfall once again. The passage was narrow, requiring him to press his back against the wet rock while water crashed just inches from his face. But once through, the space opened into a natural chamber large enough to house a small dwelling, with a ceiling high enough that a man could stand upright without concern. Daylight filtered through the waterfall, casting everything in a dim, aquamarine glow that made the preserved homestead feel like something from a dream. But there was nothing dreamlike about the careful craftsmanship that had transformed this cave into a livable space. Someone Samuel, his mind, whispered had spent considerable time and effort creating a home in this impossible place. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, built with the kind of precision that spoke of experience and patience. Above it the mantle bore the carved letters that had stopped Jed's heart the day before, S. Thorn 1847. The date placed Samuel here 27 years after their father's death. 5 years before Jed had even learned their father was gone. How long had Samuel lived in this hidden sanctuary, and why? Wooden shelves lined the walls, still holding an array of preserved foods that defied understanding. Glass jars, filled with what appeared to be pickled vegetables, dried fruits, and preserves, sat in neat rows, their contents remarkably preserved by the cave's cool, stable temperature. A barrel in one corner still held flour that, while hardened with age, showed no signs of spoilage or insect damage, but it was the personal belongings that struck Jed with the force of physical blows. A woman's dress hung from a wooden peg driven into the rock wall, its blue fabric faded but intact. Beside it hung a man's coat that Jed recognized with a shock of familiarity. Samuel had owned one, just like it when they were young men. The same heavy wool, the same bone buttons their mother had sewn on during the long winter evenings when the family gathered around the fireplace. A wooden table occupied the center of the main chamber, its surface scarred by years of use, but still solid and level. 2 chairs sat beside it, one clearly built for a man's frame, the other smaller, more delicate. The arrangement spoke of shared meals, of quiet conversations, of a life lived in partnership despite the isolation. It was beneath the table that Jed found the child's wooden horse. The toy was no larger than his hand, carved from what appeared to be pine and worn smooth by countless small fingers. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every detail of the horse's form had been lovingly rendered, from the flowing mane to the powerful legs frozen in mid-gallop. Whoever had carved this treasure possessed both skill and deep affection for the child who would receive it. Jed turned the toy over in his weathered hands, feeling the weight of implications he could barely process. Samuel had not lived alone in this cave. There had been a woman, the dress, the smaller chair, the careful preservation of household goods, all testified to her presence. And there had been children. The toy horse was evidence of innocence and joy, of small voices and laughter echoing through these stone walls. His brother had built a family in secret, hidden away from the world, behind a waterfall that most men would never think to investigate. But why such secrecy? Why not return to the ranch, claim his inheritance, and raise his children in comfort and safety? What had driven Samuel to choose this isolation over the prosperity that should have been his birthright? The questions multiplied as Jed explored deeper into the homestead. A smaller chamber connected to the main room served as a bedroom, with a rope-frame bed that still held a mattress stuffed with what felt like dried grass and pine needles. Woolen blankets lay folded at the foot of the bed, their weave tight enough to provide warmth, even in the depths of winter. A smaller bed in the corner, clearly built for a child, made Jed's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. Personal items, scattered throughout the chambers, painted a picture of lives lived with care and attention to small comforts. A hand mirror with a silver back sat on a shelf beside a wooden comb. A shaving kit rested near a basin that could be filled from a natural spring seeping through the cave's back wall. Books, actual books, occupied a shelf near the fireplace, their leather bindings cracked but readable. One volume caught Jed's attention immediately. It was a Bible, its pages yellowed with age, but its text still clear. The family name, Thorn, was inscribed in careful script on the front page, along with a date from 1845. This had been their father's Bible, the one that had sat on the mantle of the ranch house during Jed's childhood. Seeing it here, in this hidden cave, suggested Samuel had taken it when he left the ranch. But when had he left, and why? The most disturbing discovery was the complete absence of recent signs of life. Dust covered everything with the fine, even layer that spoke of years without disturbance. The fireplace contained only cold ashes that crumbled to powder at his touch. No clothing showed signs of recent wear. No food remained in bowls or on plates. Whatever story this place held had concluded long ago, leaving only artifacts and memories behind. Jed sank into one of the chairs at the wooden table, the child's horse still cradled in his hands. The implications of what he'd found crashed over him like the waterfall outside. For 50 years, he'd carried the belief that his stubborn departure from the family had been a solitary tragedy, his choice to leave, his loss to bear, his isolation to endure. But Samuel's presence here suggested the family's destruction had been more complete than Jed had ever imagined. Had Samuel also left the ranch in anger? Had their father driven away both sons with his iron will and impossible demands? Or had something else, something darker and more complex, torn the family apart after Jed's departure? The toy horse seemed to grow heavier in his hands as these thoughts circled through his mind. Somewhere in this preserved homestead lay answers to questions he'd carried for decades. But finding those answers would require him to examine artifacts and documents that might reveal truths more painful than the ignorance he'd maintained for half a century. The sound of wind whistling through the cave entrance reminded him that autumn was advancing toward winter with each passing day. Soon, the high country would become impassable, until spring. If he was going to uncover the secrets this place held, he would need to do so quickly, before snow sealed the mountains for months to come. Setting the wooden horse carefully on the table where it had likely rested for years, Jed began a more systematic exploration of the homestead. Every drawer, every shelf, Every hidden corner might hold pieces of the puzzle that would help him understand what had become of the brother he'd lost to pride and anger so many years ago. The search for answers was about to begin, and Jed suspected that what he found would change everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and the true cost of the choices that had shaped his solitary life in these unforgiving mountains. The bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon had been tucked away in a wooden box beneath the smaller bed, hidden like precious treasure. Jed's hands trembled as he lifted them into the aquamarine light filtering through the waterfall. The ribbon was silk, faded, but still soft to the touch, tied in a careful bow that spoke of reverent preservation. 23 letters in total, each one folded with meticulous care and addressed in 2 different hands. The flowing script on roughly half belonged to someone named Mary Catherine Walsh, while the bolder, more angular writing on the others was unmistakably Samuel's. Jed recognized his brother's penmanship immediately, the same careful loops and precise spacing that had filled the ranch's ledger books during their youth. With hands that felt clumsy and invasive, Jed untied the ribbon and selected the earliest letter, dated April 15th, 1845. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded it, revealing Mary's delicate handwriting in ink that had faded to brown but remained perfectly legible. "My dearest Samuel," it began, and immediately Jed felt like an intruder in an intimate conversation. But the hunger for understanding drove him to continue reading. "I cannot stop thinking about our conversation yesterday by the creek. When you spoke of building a life together away from the troubles that seemed to follow both our families, my heart fairly leaped with hope. Papa grows more difficult each day, and I fear his drinking will be the ruin of us all. Your proposal of finding somewhere we might start fresh, just the 2 of us, sounds like a dream I hardly dare believe could come true." The letter continued in this vein, filled with tender expressions of love and growing excitement about plans to leave their respective family situations behind. Mary wrote of her father's alcoholism and violent temper, of younger siblings she worried about but could no longer protect. Samuel had apparently offered her escape and sanctuary, promising to find a place where they could build something new together. Jed set the first letter aside and reached for one of Samuel's responses, dated a week later. His brother's voice came through clearly in the precise handwriting, and Jed could almost hear Samuel speaking the words aloud. "My beloved Mary, your faith in our future gives me strength to face the difficulties that lie ahead. I have been exploring the high country extensively, searching for the perfect place to build our sanctuary. Yesterday I discovered something remarkable, a waterfall that conceals a natural cave large enough to house a comfortable dwelling. The location is remote enough that we would never be disturbed, yet accessible enough that we could venture to settlements when necessary for supplies." The letter went on to describe Samuel's vision for transforming the cave into a proper home, complete with stone fireplace, wooden furniture, and storage for preserved foods that would sustain them through harsh mountain winters. His enthusiasm was infectious even across the decades, filled with detailed plans and loving promises about the life they would create together. Reading these exchanges, Jed began to understand the circumstances that had driven Samuel to this hidden refuge. The letters painted a picture of 2 young people trapped in family situations that had become unbearable, finding in each other the hope of escape and redemption. Mary's father's violence and Samuel's apparent estrangement from the ranch created circumstances that made isolation preferable to the alternatives available to them. But what had estranged Samuel from the family ranch? Jed's own departure had come 5 years after the date on these early letters. Had Samuel left even before their great confrontation? The timeline didn't align with Jed's memories of that final argument, when Samuel had stood with their father against Jed's position on the water rights. A letter dated June 3rd, 1845, provided crucial context. Mary wrote, "I am so sorry about the terrible argument with your father over your refusal to marry the Henderson girl. I know how much the ranch means to you, But surely he cannot disown his own son over such a matter. Perhaps when his anger cools, he will see reason and welcome you back into the family. The pieces began forming a pattern in Jed's mind. Samuel had apparently been forced into an unwanted engagement, had refused, and had been banished from the ranch as a result. This explained his presence in the high country years before Jed's own departure. But it also raised new questions about the family dynamics during those years when Jed thought Samuel had been the favored son. Further letters revealed the progression of their courtship and the growing reality of their plans to make the cave into a permanent home. Samuel wrote with increasing confidence about his preparations. "I have completed the fireplace and begun work on proper furniture. The cave stays remarkably cool in summer and holds warmth well when heated. I believe we could live quite comfortably here, perhaps more peacefully than either of us has known in our family homes." Mary's responses showed equal enthusiasm, mixed with practical concerns about the isolation and hardships they would face. But her love for Samuel shone through every line, and her determination to escape her father's violence made the cave sanctuary seem like paradise by comparison. The letters from late 1845 took on a different tone as their wedding plans solidified. Mary wrote, "I have been gathering supplies, secretly fabric for curtains, seeds for a small garden plot near the cave entrance, preserving jars for the foods we'll need to store. Mrs. Patterson at the general store asks no questions when I make my purchases. Bless her kind heart." Samuel's corresponding letters detailed his construction projects with obvious pride. "The bed frame is complete, as are 2 chairs for our table. I've carved decorative details into the headboard that I hope will please you, roses and vines, like the ones that grew outside your bedroom window at home." Reading these intimate exchanges, Jed felt his understanding of his brother completely reshape. The Samuel he too thus remembered had been serious and dutiful, focused on ranch business and their father's expectations. But these letters revealed a man capable of deep romantic love, willing to sacrifice comfort and security for the woman he cherished. The cave homestead represented not exile, but choice, the deliberate creation of a sanctuary where love could flourish away from family pressures and societal demands. The final letters in the bundle, dated from early 1846, made reference to their wedding ceremony, a simple affair conducted by a traveling preacher in the valley below, witnessed only by Mary's younger sister and a family friend. Samuel wrote, "When you spoke your vows yesterday, my heart felt too large for my chest. To know that you are truly my wife, that we will build our life together in our hidden sanctuary, makes all the hardships of the past year fade into insignificance." Mary's last letter in the bundle, written just days after their wedding, overflowed with happiness and hope. "Our first week as husband and wife has been everything I dreamed it would be. The cave truly feels like home now, filled with love and laughter. I can hardly believe that such happiness is possible after all the sorrow we have both known." But as Jed carefully refolded the final letter and retied the blue ribbon, questions crowded his mind. If Samuel and Mary had found such happiness here, what had happened to them? The homestead showed clear signs of long habitation, but equally clear signs of eventual abandonment. Somewhere in this preserved sanctuary lay answers to what had become of their joy, their plans, their shared future. The wooden box beneath the bed held more than just love letters. It contained the foundation of a mystery that grew more complex with each revelation. The family Bible rested on the shelf beside the fireplace like a silent sentinel, its leather binding worn smooth by countless hands. Jed approached it with the reverence he remembered from childhood. Sunday mornings, when their father would read aloud from its pages while the family gathered around the ranch house table. The gold lettering on the cover had faded to barely visible traces, but the weight of the book in his hands felt exactly as he remembered. Opening to the front pages, Jed found the family records section, where births, deaths, and marriages had been carefully documented in various hands across the generations. His grandfather's precise script recorded the earliest entries, followed by his father's bolder writing, and finally his heart clenched Samuel's familiar penmanship, completing the more recent records. The marriage entry appeared first. Samuel James Thorn wed to Mary Catherine Walsh, March 23, 1846, witnessed by Ellen Walsh and Thomas Patterson, ceremony performed by Reverend Jonathan Mills. The date aligned with the final love letters, confirming the timeline Jed had begun to piece together from their correspondence. But it was the birth records that stopped his breath entirely. Sarah Elizabeth Thorn, born November 15, 1846, to Samuel and Mary Thorn. The entry was written in Samuel's careful script, with a small notation in the margin: healthy girl, 7 pounds, born during first snowfall. Below that, James Samuel Thorn, born April 2, 1848, to Samuel and Mary Thorn. Strong boy, born at sunrise. And finally, Daniel Thomas Thorn, born September 10, 1849, to Samuel and Mary Thorn. Smallest of our children, but fierce spirit. Jed sank into the larger of the two chairs, the Bible trembling in his hands. 3 children. Samuel and Mary had brought 3 children into the world in this hidden sanctuary, had built a family behind the waterfall while Jed roamed the mountains in solitude, unaware that his brother had become a father. But the birth records were not the end of the story recorded in these sacred pages. With growing dread, Jed turned his attention to the death records that followed, written in the same careful hand but with ink that seemed darker, pressed deeper into the paper as if each word had been carved with grief. Sarah Elizabeth Thorn died February 3, 1852, age 5 years. Taken by fever despite all our efforts. God rest her precious soul. The date hit Jed like a physical blow. February 1852, the depths of winter, when the high country would have been completely isolated, cut off from any medical help that might have saved a sick child. He could imagine Samuel and Mary desperately fighting the fever, trying every remedy they knew, helpless as their firstborn slipped away from them in this remote sanctuary that had become a prison. The second entry followed just weeks later. James Samuel Thorn died February 18, 1852, aged 3 years. Same fever that took his sister. We could not save him either. 15 days. Samuel and Mary had lost 2 children in just over 2 weeks, watching helplessly as the fever that claimed their daughter also took their son. The isolation that had protected their love had become a curse when medical help was needed most desperately. The final death record was the cruelest of all. Daniel Thomas Thorn died March 1, 1852, aged 2 years. The fever took him as it took his brother and sister. All our babies gone, our hearts are broken. 3 children, all lost to the same illness within a single month. Jed could barely comprehend the magnitude of grief that must have filled this cave in the spring of 1852. The careful preparations, the loving construction of the smaller bed, the hand-carved wooden horse, all had been rendered meaningless by disease and isolation. But there were more entries in the death records, and with trembling fingers, Jed read the final devastating notation. Mary Catherine Thorn died April 15, 1852, aged 26 years. Could not bear the loss of our children, took her own life rather than face another day without them. May God forgive what I could not prevent. The Bible slipped from Jed's nerveless fingers, landing on the wooden table with a sound that echoed through the cave like thunder. Mary had taken her own life just weeks after losing all 3 children. The grief had been too much to bear, the weight of loss too heavy to carry in this isolated sanctuary that had once represented their hope for the future. Samuel's final entry in the family records explained everything. Samuel James Thorn, last of his line, records this on April 16, 1852. I have buried my wife beside our children in the meadow beyond the cave. I cannot bear to remain in this place that holds so much sorrow, yet I cannot bear to leave them either. May whoever finds this record understand that we were happy once, that love lived here before death claimed everything we held dear. The date of that final entry was significant, April 16th, 1852. But Samuel had clearly survived beyond that date because Jed had found evidence of continued habitation in the cave. Food stores, personal belongings, signs that someone had lived here for years after the deaths of Mary and the children. Samuel had remained alone in the place that had once been their paradise. Jed wiped tears from his weathered cheeks, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his brother's suffering. While Jed had nursed his wounded pride through decades of self-imposed exile, Samuel had endured the loss of everything that mattered: wife, children, hope itself. The cave had become both sanctuary and tomb, a place where love had flourished and died, where dreams had been built and shattered. Understanding began to dawn about why Samuel had never returned to the family ranch, never attempted reconciliation. How could a man who had lost everything rebuild his life in a place that would remind him of what he'd sacrificed for pride and principle? The ranch would have been full of echoes, children's laughter in the yard, women's voices in the kitchen, the bustle of family life that Samuel would never know again. Rising slowly from the chair, Jed walked to the cave entrance, where the sound of falling water had become a constant backdrop to his discoveries. Beyond the waterfall, somewhere in the meadows Samuel had mentioned, lay graves that held the physical remains of the family his brother had loved and lost. But first, he needed to understand how long Samuel had survived after that terrible spring of 1852 and what had finally ended his solitary vigil in this chamber of echoes and memories. The Bible had revealed the tragedy that had destroyed Samuel's family, but it had not explained what had ultimately become of the man who had chosen to remain with their graves rather than seek solace among the living. Somewhere in this preserved homestead, more answers waited to be discovered. In a leather portfolio tucked beneath Samuel's side of the rope-frame bed, Jed discovered documents that changed everything he thought he understood about his brother's final years. The portfolio was crafted from fine leather, the bin kind their father had favored for important ranch documents, and it contained papers that had been preserved with the same meticulous care as everything else in the cave homestead. The hand-drawn map spread across the wooden table like a bridge between past and present. Samuel's precise draftsmanship was evident in every carefully rendered detail: mountain peaks positioned with surveyor's accuracy, creek beds traced with flowing lines, and trail markers noted with the kind of attention that spoke of multiple scouting expeditions. But this was not a map of the immediate territory around the cave. This was a detailed route guide from the hidden waterfall all the way down to the Thorn family ranch in the valley below. Jed studied the map with growing amazement. Samuel had marked multiple trail options, noting seasonal variations, water sources, and approximate travel times for each segment of the journey. Marginal notes in his brother's handwriting indicated the best camping spots, dangerous passages to avoid during storm season, and even locations where supplies could be cached for extended journeys. Northern route, 3 days in good weather, avoid during spring melt. Southern approach through Devil's Canyon, longer but more sheltered, suitable for winter travel. Emergency route via Eagle Pass, difficult but passable in extremes. These were not the casual notations of someone exploring unfamiliar territory. They represented careful reconnaissance conducted over an extended period, the kind of detailed preparation that suggested serious intent to use the routes for their intended purpose. Samuel had not simply known how to reach the family ranch, he had planned multiple ways to get there under various circumstances. But why create such detailed maps if he never intended to make the journey? The question gnawed at Jed as he examined other documents in the portfolio. Travel planning sheets showed careful calculations of supplies needed for journeys of varying lengths. lists of items to purchase in town, even rough drafts of letters addressed to people Jed didn't recognize, apparently inquiring about conditions on the ranch and the health of family members. One document stood out with particular clarity, a detailed inventory of personal effects Samuel planned to bring with him on a journey home. The list included Mary's wedding ring, a lock of Sarah's hair, small toys that had belonged to each of the children, and the family Bible. At the bottom of the list, Samuel had written in darker ink, "Items to help Father understand what I have lost and why I stayed away so long." The implications hit Jed like an avalanche. Samuel had been planning to return home. Despite the grief, despite the years of isolation, despite everything that had driven him to the cave in the first place, his brother had been preparing to face the family and attempt some form of reconciliation. The maps, the supply lists, the carefully planned routes all pointed toward a man gathering courage for the most difficult journey of his life. A separate sheet contained what appeared to be drafts of a letter to their father, written in Samuel's increasingly shaky handwriting. The words had been crossed out and rewritten multiple times, showing the struggle to find language adequate for bridging decades of separation and explaining losses too profound for simple description. "Dear Father," one version began, "I know you believe I left the ranch in defiance and selfishness, but the truth is more complicated than either of us understood at the time. I have learned things about loss and regret that I pray you will never have to experience, but which I hope might help you understand why I could not return sooner." Another attempt started differently. "I do not expect forgiveness for the years I stayed away, but I hope you will allow me to explain what became of the son you remember. The mountains have taught me hard lessons about the cost of defem, pride, and the weight of choices. I would like to share those lessons with you, if you will have me." The final version, apparently the one Samuel had been most satisfied with, was longer and more detailed. "Father, I write this letter knowing that you may refuse to see me, knowing that I have no right to ask for welcome after so many years of silence. But I also write knowing that death comes to all men and that some conversations cannot be postponed indefinitely. I have things to tell you about loss and love, about the family I built and lost in these mountains, about the man I became in exile and the son I hope to be again before our time together ends." Jed's hands shook as he read these attempts at reconciliation. Every line revealed the struggle of a man trying to bridge an impossible gap, to explain the unexplainable, to seek forgiveness for choices that had seemed necessary at the time but had led to decades of isolation and regret. But the most telling document in the collection was a travel schedule, written in Samuel's careful script and dated just 2 years earlier, 1860. The schedule outlined a planned departure from the cave in late spring, allowing time to reach the ranch before the summer heat made travel difficult for an aging man. Supply caches were marked on the map along the intended route. Even contingency plans were noted in case weather or other circumstances delayed the journey. The schedule had never been implemented. Jed searched through the remaining documents, looking for some explanation of what had prevented Samuel from following through on his carefully laid plans. Health concerns, perhaps? A change of heart? Some external circumstance that made the journey impossible? The answer lay in a medical journal tucked beneath the travel papers. Samuel had been documenting his own declining health with the same meticulous attention he gave to everything else. Entries dating from 1859 onward showed increasing problems with breathing, chest pains that came more frequently, and a persistent cough that worsened each winter. November 15th, 1860. One entry read, "The pain in my chest makes climbing difficult. I fear the journey home may be beyond my strength now. Perhaps I waited too long to make peace with the past." The final medical entry, dated March 3rd, 1861, was written in a barely legible scrawl. "Can no longer manage the heavy work of maintaining the cave. Food supplies running low. If I am to make the journey home, it must be soon, or it will never be possible at all. But Samuel had not made the journey. The maps remained unused, the supply caches unretrieved, the letters to his father undelivered. Something had prevented him from taking those final steps toward reconciliation, and that something might explain why Jed had found the cave homestead preserved exactly as Samuel had left it, waiting like a shrine to hopes that had never been fulfilled. Hidden behind a loose stone in the cave wall, Jed discovered Mary's medical journal alongside a collection of dried herbs that still retained traces of their healing properties after more than a decade. The journal was bound in soft leather and filled with Mary's delicate handwriting, documenting her efforts to serve as the family's healer and protector in their isolated sanctuary. The entries began, hopefully, with detailed observations about the medicinal plants that grew in the high meadows surrounding their hidden home. Mary had approached healing with the same methodical care that characterized everything else about the cave homestead, cataloging each plant's properties, optimal harvesting times, and preparation methods. June 15th, 1847, read 1 early entry. Found excellent willow bark grove near the North Meadow. Harvested enough to last through winter for Samuel's occasional headaches. The children are strong and healthy, praise God, but I want to be prepared for any illness that might come. Her knowledge was extensive, clearly learned from someone with considerable experience in frontier medicine. Entries detailed the preparation of poultices for wounds, teas for stomach ailments, and tinctures for various common complaints. She noted which herbs worked best in combination, how to store them for maximum potency, and even seasonal variations in their effectiveness. But as Jed read deeper into the journal, the entries took on an increasingly desperate tone. The terrible winter of 1851 to 1852 had brought challenges that no amount of preparation could overcome. January 10th, 1852, Mary wrote in handwriting that showed the strain she was under. Sarah has developed a fever that will not break despite willow bark tea and cool compresses. Her breathing is labored, and she complains of pain in her chest. I have tried everything I know, but she grows weaker each day. Samuel and I take turns sitting with her through the night, but I fear we are helpless against whatever disease has taken hold. The entries that followed documented the progression of the illness through their small family with heartbreaking detail. Mary had fought the fever with every remedy in her considerable arsenal: steam inhalations with pine needles, poultices of ground mustard seed, teas brewed from elderberry and echinacea. But the disease had proven stronger than her knowledge and determination. January 28th, 1852, she recorded with shaking handwriting. James now shows the same symptoms as Sarah. The fever burns so hot in both children that I can barely touch their skin. They struggle to breathe, and their coughs are wet and terrible. Samuel has collapsed from exhaustion after 3 weeks of nursing the sick. I fear I am losing them all, and there is nothing more I can do. The journal entries became sporadic as the crisis deepened, often just brief notes scrawled between desperate attempts at treatment. Fever worse, no improvement, praying for miracle, each entry shorter than the last, as if Mary's strength for recording their struggle was failing along with her children's health. February 3rd, 1852, Sarah passed in the early morning hours. She fought so bravely, but the fever was too strong. Samuel cannot stop weeping. James and Daniel grow sicker by the hour. The death of their first child marked a turning point in Mary's entries. Her careful, methodical approach to healing gave way to increasingly frantic attempts to save her remaining sons. She tried combinations of treatments that bordered on desperation, anything that might break the fever or ease their labored breathing. February 18th, 1852, James left us today. My beautiful boy, so full of life and laughter, taken by the same cruel disease that claimed his sister. Only Daniel remains, and he grows weaker despite everything I do. I begin to wonder if God has abandoned us in this place that once felt so blessed. The journal's most devastating entries came after the loss of their youngest child. March 1st, 1852. Daniel died in my arms this morning. All three of our babies are gone. The herbs and remedies that once gave me such confidence have proven worthless against this terrible sickness. I could not save any of them. I have failed as a mother, as a healer, as everything that mattered. But it was Mary's final entries that revealed the depth of her suffering and the decision that would ultimately claim her life as well. March 15th, 1852. The silence in this cave has become unbearable. Everywhere I look, I see reminders of the children we have lost, their toys, their clothes, their little beds. Samuel tries to comfort me, but he is drowning in his own grief. We both know we will never recover from this loss. March 30th, 1852. I cannot bear another day in this place. The herbs that once brought healing now mock me with their uselessness. I see my babies' faces in every shadow, hear their voices in every echo. Samuel does not understand, but the pain has become larger than my ability to carry it. Her final entry, written in an unsteady hand, was dated April 14th, 1852. I have prepared a final tea from the plants I once used for healing. But this time, I seek not to heal, but to end the suffering that has become my only companion. I pray Samuel will forgive me, and that I will see our children again in whatever realm awaits beyond this world of sorrow. I cannot take another breath in a place where their laughter once echoed. Alongside the journal, Jed found the dried remains of Mary's extensive herb collection. Neat bundles still hung from wooden pegs driven into the cave wall, their labels written in her careful script. Chamomile for sleep, feverfew for headaches, comfrey for wounds, an entire pharmacy of natural remedies that had served the family well until facing a disease beyond their power to treat. But among the healing herbs, Jed also found evidence of the plants Mary had used for her final tragic purpose. Foxglove, known for its beauty and its deadly properties. Hemlock, whose innocent appearance masked lethal potential. She had used her knowledge of plants not to heal, but to end her suffering, turning her greatest skill against herself in her darkest hour. The irony was, crushing Mary had possessed the knowledge to ease countless ailments, had kept her family healthy through years of isolated mountain living, yet could not save them from the one disease that mattered most. Her expertise had become a burden rather than a blessing, a constant reminder of her failure to protect the children she loved more than life itself. Samuel's marginal notes in the journal, written in ink of a different color, showed his own attempts to understand and cope with Mary's final decision. She was the strongest person I ever knew, he had written beside her last entry. That she could not bear this loss shows not weakness, but the magnitude of what we have endured together. Tucked inside Samuel's coat pocket, the same coat that had hung on the wooden peg for over a decade, Jed found a letter that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family's story. The envelope was addressed in Samuel's familiar handwriting to Jedediah Thorn, last known location, Colorado High Country, but it had never been sealed, never been sent. The paper was worn soft from repeated handling, as if Samuel had read and reread his own words countless times before making the decision to keep them forever undelivered. Jed's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, recognizing immediately that this was Samuel's final attempt to reach across the chasm of years and pride that had separated them for so long. The date at the top read, September 15th, 1861, less than a year ago, according to Jed's best calculation of the current date. My dear brother Jedediah, the letter began, and immediately Jed felt the weight of Samuel's love and longing in those simple words. I do not know if this letter will ever reach you, or if you would read it if it did, but I find myself compelled to write it nonetheless. Time grows short for me now, and there are things I must say while I still have breath to speak them, even if only to the wind and stones of this mountain refuge that has been both my salvation and my prison. First, I must tell you that I have thought of you every day for the past 50 years. Not a morning has passed without wondering where you might be, whether you were safe, whether you had found some measure of peace in your chosen exile. I have always hoped that your stubborn courage, the same trait that drove you away from the ranch that terrible night, would keep you alive in whatever wild places you chose to make your home. I know you believed that you left the family in anger over principles and water rights, and that you have carried guilt about that departure all these years. But I must tell you now what I could not tell you then. Your leaving was not the tragedy you believe it to be. Father was wrong about the mining contracts. You were right to oppose them, right to see them as a betrayal of everything grandfather built. Within 2 years of your departure, the mining company had poisoned 3 creek beds and caused a landslide that killed 2 neighboring ranches. The water rights deal was cancelled, but by then the damage was done. More important than being right about the contracts, Jedediah, is this truth I have carried in my heart for 5 decades. I never blamed you for leaving. I understood why you had to go. Father's word was law in that house, and he gave you no choice but submission or exile. You chose exile, and I respected that choice, even as it broke my heart to see you walk away. What you could not have known, because I was too proud and foolish to tell you at the time, was that I too left the ranch only 3 months after your departure. Father had arranged a marriage for me with the Henderson girl, despite my repeated refusal to court her. When I continued to resist, he gave me the same ultimatum he gave you: obey or leave. Unlike you, I waited until the last possible moment, hoping for some reconciliation that never came. But in the end, I too chose exile over submission. I found love in these mountains, brother. A woman named Mary Catherine, whose heart was as beautiful as the wild flowers that bloom in the high meadows each spring. We built a life together behind this waterfall, raised 3 children in a sanctuary that felt like paradise. For 7 years, we knew happiness that neither of us had believed possible. Our children, Sarah, James, and Daniel, filled this cave with laughter and brought us joy beyond measure. But joy in this world is fragile, and ours was shattered in the winter of 1852. A fever came to our hidden valley, one that no earthly medicine could cure. We lost all 3 children within a month, watched helplessly as the disease took everything we held dear. Mary could not bear the grief. She joined the children in death, leaving me alone with graves to tend and memories too heavy to carry. I have lived 10 years in this cave since losing them, Jedediah. 10 years of solitude that have taught me things about loneliness and regret that I pray you never have to learn. I stayed here because I could not bear to leave them, but also because I could not bear to face the world again after losing everything that gave my life meaning. The ranch, our father, the family quarrels, all of it seemed meaningless compared to the weight of my grief. But as death approaches and I can feel it coming like winter in my bones, I find myself thinking not of the family I lost, but of the brother I left behind. I think of all the words we never spoke, all the reconciliations we never attempted, all the years we wasted nursing wounded pride instead of seeking each other out in this vast wilderness where we both chose to make our exile. I forgive you, brother, for every harsh word spoken in that final argument. I forgive you for leaving without looking back, for choosing your principles over family peace. I forgive you because I understand now that some choices are forced upon us by circumstances beyond our control, and that a man must live with his decisions regardless of their cost. But more than forgiveness, I want you to know love. You were my brother, my companion in childhood, my partner in all the adventures and mischiefs of youth. Distance and time and bitter words could never change that truth. Whatever anger I felt at your departure was overwhelmed long ago by simple love and the ache of missing you. I hope that somewhere in these mountains you have found peace. I hope you have known companionship, if not love. I hope the wilderness has been kinder to you than it was to me, though it taught us both hard lessons about the cost of pride and the weight of choices. If you ever return to the ranch, and I pray that you will, for the family name should not die with us, you will find that Father passed in 1855. His final words, according to the letter young Tom Patterson brought me years ago, were regret for the sons he drove away with his uncompromising demands. He died hoping for forgiveness he never asked for, reconciliation he never sought. The ranch belongs to us now, brother, if either of us chooses to claim it. I will not live to see another spring, but you might still have years ahead of you. Do not let our family's story end in exile and regret. Go home, Jedediah. Make peace with the past, even if you cannot make peace with the dead. Someone should remember the good times we shared, should honor the love that existed before pride and stubbornness tore it apart. I have loved you all these years, brother, across distance and silence and the weight of unspoken words. I have missed you every day of my exile, and I will carry that love with me wherever souls go when they leave these mountain peaks behind. Your brother always. Samuel. Jed read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit him like an avalanche. Samuel had forgiven him decades ago, had never blamed him for the family rift, had understood and respected Jed's choice to leave, even as it broke his heart. All these years, Jed had carried guilt and anger over a departure that his brother had seen not as betrayal, but as principle, courageously defended. But the most devastating revelation was the simplest. Samuel had loved him throughout their long separation, had missed him, thought of him daily, hoped for his well-being across 50 years of silence. The brother Jed, remembered as serious and judgmental, had been carrying love and longing that matched his own, 2 men mourning the same loss without ever knowing they shared that grief. The letter changed everything, not just Jed's understanding of the past, but his comprehension of choices yet to be made. Samuel's plea for him to return to the ranch, to claim their inheritance, to ensure that the family name didn't die in exile, echoed like a voice from beyond death itself. But first, Jed needed to understand why this letter, this message of love and forgiveness that could have healed both their hearts, had never been sent. What had prevented Samuel from reaching out across the wilderness to find the brother he missed so desperately? The answer to that question would determine how Jed carried Samuel's final message forward into whatever remained of his own life in these unforgiving mountains. Beside the undelivered letter, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth that had once been part of a child's dress, Jed found Samuel's wedding ring. The simple gold band caught what little light filtered through the waterfall, gleaming with the same warm radiance it must have held on the day Samuel had placed it on his finger while speaking vows to Mary Catherine. But it was what lay beneath the ring that brought Jed to his knees in the center of the cave, a small pile of personal effects that represented the final chapter of Samuel's story. The ring itself was worn smooth from decades of wear, its surface polished by countless unconscious touches as Samuel had twisted it during moments of worry or remembrance. Inside the band, barely visible in the dim light, Jed could make out an engraving. S and M forever, the 23rd of March, 1846. The date matched the Bible's record of their wedding, and the simple inscription spoke of hope and permanence in a world that had proven to offer neither. But Samuel had removed the ring before his death, placing it carefully with the letter and other items he'd wanted to preserve. The gesture suggested a man preparing for the end, gathering the artifacts that had defined his life and arranging them with the same meticulous care he'd brought to everything else in the cave homestead. Jed's emotional breakdown came without warning. 50 years of suppressed grief hitting him like a dam burst in spring flood. He had never allowed himself to fully mourn the loss of his family, the brother he'd left behind, the father whose approval he'd never sought after that final argument. Mountain life had required him to bury such emotions deep, to focus on survival rather than sorrow. But Samuel's letter had torn open wounds Jed didn't even know he carried, and the sight of his brother's wedding ring, symbol of a love and life Jed had never known existed, released a torrent of tears that had been building for decades. He wept for Samuel's children, innocents who had died in isolation, while their uncle roamed the same mountains, oblivious to their existence. He wept for Mary, driven to desperation by grief too large for her heart to contain. He wept for Samuel himself, spending his final years alone in this stone chamber, surrounded by memories of joy that had been snatched away by disease and death. But most of all, Jed wept for the 50 years of separation that need never have happened, the love that had persisted despite distance and silence, the forgiveness that had been freely given but never communicated, the loneliness they had both endured while missing the same person, carrying the same grief, hoping for the same reconciliation that pride and stubbornness had prevented. As the storm of emotion gradually subsided, Jed began to understand what he needed to do. Samuel's letter had been a plea not just for forgiveness, but for action. His brother had died, hoping someone would remember the good times, would honor the love that had existed before pride tore it apart. Samuel had asked Jed to go home, to claim their inheritance, to ensure the family story didn't end in exile and regret. But before Jed could even consider returning to the world below, he had responsibilities here in this mountain sanctuary. Samuel, Mary, and their children deserved proper recognition of their lives and deaths. They deserved graves marked with more than wooden crosses and memories. They deserved to have their story told, their love honored, their tragedy acknowledged by the only person left who could bear witness to what they had built and lost. Jed spent the remainder of the day gathering items that told the story of Samuel's family: the wooden horse that had belonged to one of the children, Mary's wedding dress still hanging on its peg like a ghost of vanished happiness, the family Bible with its careful records of births, deaths, and enduring love, Samuel's maps and letters, evidence of his planned reconciliation that had been prevented by failing health and approaching death. Each item spoke of lives lived with intention and care, despite the isolation that had defined their circumstances. Samuel and Mary had created not just a home, but a sanctuary where love could flourish away from the pressures and demands of the outside world. Their children had known happiness and security in this hidden valley, at least until disease had claimed them all. As evening shadows began to fill the cave, Jed made his decision. He would honor Samuel's memory by giving his brother and his family the burial they deserved. He would create a proper memorial that acknowledged their lives and their love. And then, carrying Samuel's wedding ring and the letter that had changed everything, he would make the journey his brother had planned, but never completed. He would go home. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying. Jed had spent 50 years in the wilderness, had become something harder and more remote than the young man who'd left the ranch in anger. Could he readjust to life among people? Could he face whatever remained of their family, carrying news of Samuel's death and the tragedy that had preceded it? Could he claim a place in a world he'd rejected half a century ago? But Samuel's letter had made clear that someone needed to remember, needed to carry their story forward into whatever future awaited the Thorn family name. Jed was the only person left who could fulfill that responsibility, the only one who knew the truth about what had happened in this mountain sanctuary, the only witness to the love and loss that had defined Samuel's hidden life. The task ahead would require him to gather supplies for the journey to the valley, to prepare for the physical and emotional challenges of rejoining civilization after decades of solitude. He would need to decide which artifacts to carry with him as evidence of Samuel's story, which items to leave behind as memorial to the family that had lived and died in this place. But first, he needed to find the grave Samuel had mentioned in the Bible, the resting place where his brother had buried Mary and their children in the meadow beyond the cave. Those graves would need proper markers, proper recognition of the lives they represented. Jed owed his brother that much, owed the memory of the family he'd never known, that simple acknowledgement of their existence. Standing in the cave as darkness settled over the mountains, surrounded by the preserved remnants of Samuel's life, Jed felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a pack he would carry for the rest of his days. He was no longer just a solitary mountain man, living only for his own survival. He had become the keeper of memories, the bearer of stories, the only person who could ensure that Samuel's love and sacrifice would not be forgotten. Samuel's wedding ring felt warm in his palm, as if it still carried some trace of the vows spoken over it so many years ago. S&M forever. The inscription had proven prophetic in ways the young couple could never have imagined. Their love had indeed lasted forever, preserved in this mountain sanctuary like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. Now it was Jed's turn to carry that love forward, to honor the bond between brothers that had survived decades of separation and silence. Samuel's letter had been his brother's final gift, not just forgiveness, but a mission that would give new meaning to whatever years remained in Jed's own life. The mountains had taught him about survival and solitude, but Samuel's hidden homestead had taught him something far more important, that love persists across time and distance, that family bonds can survive even the deepest wounds, and that it's never too late to choose connection over isolation, forgiveness over pride. Tomorrow would begin the most difficult journey of Jed's life, not the physical challenge of reaching the valley, but the emotional challenge of returning home to claim a place in a family he'd left behind 50 years ago. He would carry with him the story of a brother who had found love and lost it, who had forgiven without being asked, who had died hoping for reconciliation that had come too late. But tonight, in this chamber of memories and preserved dreams, Jed would keep vigil beside the artifacts of Samuel's life, honoring the love that had built this sanctuary and preparing for the moment when he would step back into a world he had forgotten how to navigate. At dawn, Jed ventured beyond the waterfall to search for the grave Samuel had mentioned in his Bible entries. The meadow stretched before him like a natural cathedral, surrounded by towering peaks that caught the first light of morning and held it like cupped hands. Wildflowers that had gone to seed dotted the grass with brown stalks, and a small stream wound through the center of the clearing, its water singing softly over smooth stones. He found the graves on a gentle rise overlooking the stream, marked by simple wooden crosses that had weathered but not fallen during the decade since Samuel had placed them there. 4 graves in total, 3 small ones clustered together like sleeping children, and a larger one set slightly apart. The arrangement spoke of a father's careful attention to keeping his family close, even in death. Beside the largest grave, Jed discovered Mary's prayer book, its leather binding cracked by years of weather, but still intact enough to protect the pages within. Samuel had placed it there deliberately, as if ensuring that Mary's faith would watch over the family's resting place long after he himself was gone. The book fell open in Jed's hands to passages marked with pressed wildflowers that had faded to transparent memories of their former beauty. The prayers written in Mary's delicate handwriting filled the margins of the printed text, personal appeals to a God she had continued to trust even as tragedy overwhelmed her family. Please, Lord, let Sarah's fever break by morning. Give me wisdom to know how to help her breathe easier. Strengthen my hands for whatever healing work you require of me. Another prayer, written in darker ink that suggested desperation. Father in heaven, I have tried everything I know to save James, but he grows weaker each hour. If it is your will to take him home, please let it be gentle. He is so small, and he has suffered enough. Let him go peacefully if he cannot stay. The final prayer, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible, broke Jed's heart with its raw honesty. God, I do not understand why. You have taken all 3 of our babies. I do not understand what sin we committed to deserve such punishment, but I trust that they are safe with you now, free from fever and pain. Help me find a way to bear this grief, or show me how to join them in your kingdom. Standing among the graves with Mary's prayer book in his hands, Jed felt the full weight of his brother's loss settling on his shoulders. To love something so completely and then lose it to forces beyond human control, he could not imagine how Samuel had found the strength to continue living after burying his entire family in this remote meadow. But Samuel had continued, had survived 10 years alone in the cave with only memories for company. The man Jed remembered from their youth had possessed that kind of stubborn endurance, the ability to bear whatever burdens life placed on him without complaint or self-pity. Those qualities had apparently sustained him through a grief that would have destroyed a weaker person. Jed knelt beside Samuel's grave and placed his weathered hand on the wooden cross that bore his brother's name. "I found your letter, Sam," he said aloud, his voice strange in the mountain silence. "I know now that you forgave me long ago, that you understood why I had to leave. I'm sorry I never came looking for you. I'm sorry you faced all this alone." The words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what needed to be said. How could language bridge 50 years of separation and misunderstanding? How could simple sentences carry the weight of love and regret that had accumulated like snow on these mountain peaks? But as Jed spoke to his brother's grave, he felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and guilt he'd carried for so long. Samuel's letter had offered forgiveness, but Jed was learning that accepting that gift required him to forgive himself as well. The young man who had walked away from the family ranch in pride and stubbornness had been doing the best he could with the choices available to him. The decades of exile that followed had been his way of honoring principles he couldn't compromise, even at the cost of family connection. Perhaps Samuel had understood that better than anyone, having made his own choice to leave rather than submit to their father's demands. Both brothers had chosen exile over surrender, had paid the price of isolation for the privilege of living according to their own consciences. The tragedy was not their choices, but the silence that had prevented them from knowing they shared the same values, the same courage, the same willingness to sacrifice comfort for principle. Reading from Mary's prayer book, Jed spoke words of blessing over the family's graves, honoring lives cut short, but not wasted, love interrupted, but not destroyed. The pressed flowers between the pages scattered in the mountain wind, like tiny prayers released to whatever realm Samuel and his family now inhabited. As he prepared to return to the cave and begin his own journey toward reconciliation, Jed carried with him the peace that comes from understanding that some forms of love transcend death, separation, and time itself. Samuel's family would rest easier, knowing their story would not die with them in this mountain meadow, knowing someone would carry their memory forward into whatever future awaited the Thorn family name. Back in the cave, as Jed gathered the most precious artifacts to carry on his journey home, he made one final discovery that would forever change how he understood his place in the Thorn family story. Hidden in the inner pocket of Samuel's vest, he found a gold pocket watch that had belonged to their father, the same timepiece Jed remembered from childhood Sunday mornings, when the old man would check it solemnly before calling the family to worship. The watch's case was worn smooth from decades of handling, and when Jed pressed the small button to open it, the familiar melody of its chime brought tears to his eyes. But it was what he discovered inside the watch case that stopped his breath entirely, a small daguerreotype photograph of their parents, taken during the early years of their marriage, when hope and love had still softened their father's stern features. The photograph was no larger than a silver dollar, but every detail was preserved with crystalline clarity. Their mother smiled from the image with the gentle warmth Jed remembered from his earliest memories before illness had taken her when he was barely 12 years old. Their father stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, his expression proud but tender, a far cry from the hard, uncompromising man he had become after her death. But it was the inscription on the back of the time photograph that revealed the most profound truth of all. In their father's careful handwriting, "For my beloved sons, Samuel and Jedediah, may you remember that love built this family, and love alone can preserve it. Your devoted father, James Thorn, 1825. The date placed the inscription during the early years of Jed's childhood, when their father had been a different man, softer, more given to expressions of affection, still hopeful about the future he was building with his wife and sons. The man who had written those words about love preserving the family was the same man who would later drive both sons away with his rigid demands and impossible expectations. Jed understood now that their father's harshness had been born of grief, the slow hardening of a man who had lost the woman he loved and didn't know how to carry that loss without becoming bitter. The water rights argument, the arranged marriages, the ultimatums that had forced his sons to choose between submission and exile, all of it had stemmed from a broken heart that had forgotten how to bend without breaking. Samuel's final letter had mentioned their father's dying words: regret for the sons he had driven away, hope for forgiveness he had never asked for. Perhaps in those final moments, the dying man had remembered the younger version of himself who had inscribed a photograph with words about love preserving family bonds. The pocket watch represented more than just a family heirloom. It was evidence that love had indeed built the Thorn family, even if pride and stubbornness had later threatened to destroy it. The photograph inside connected 3 generations, the hopeful young parents who had dreamed of building something lasting, the sons who had been forced to choose between loyalty and conscience, and now Jed himself, the last surviving member of a family that had nearly destroyed itself through misunderstanding and wounded pride. With reverent care, Jed selected the items he would carry on his journey home: Samuel's final letter written with love and forgiveness, Mary's prayer book with its pressed flowers and appeals to divine mercy, the wooden horse that had brought joy to children who had died too young, the family Bible with its careful records of births, deaths, and enduring faith, and now the pocket watch with its hidden photograph that proved love had been the foundation of everything they had built and lost. Each artifact told part of the story he would need to share, not just with whatever family members remained, but with anyone who would listen to the tale of love that had persisted across decades of separation and silence. Samuel's story deserved to be remembered, not as tragedy, but as testament to the power of forgiveness and the unbreakable bonds between brothers. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jed took one final walk through the cave homestead that had preserved his brother's life like an insect caught in amber. The stone fireplace, where Samuel and Mary had shared countless evening meals. The bed where their children had slept safely, at least until illness claimed them. The shelves where Mary had stored her healing herbs and Samuel had kept his careful records. Everything spoke of lives lived with intention and care, of love that had flourished despite isolation and hardship. This had been a home in the truest sense, not because of its physical comforts, but because of the bonds between the people who had shared its shelter. Tomorrow, Jed would begin the journey that would carry him back to the world of towns and ranches, of neighbors and family obligations. He would use Samuel's maps to navigate the physical route, but he would carry his brother's love as compass for the more difficult emotional terrain that lay ahead. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking moments that connected past to present, memory to hope, isolation to the possibility of reconciliation. Time had not healed all wounds, but it had taught valuable lessons about the cost of pride and the enduring power of love to bridge even the deepest separations. Soon, the last Thorn would walk out of the wilderness and claim his place in whatever remained of the family story. The journey down from the high country took Jed 4 days, following Samuel's carefully marked trails through terrain that seemed both familiar and strange after decades in the wilderness. Each mile carried him closer to a world he had left as a young man and would re-enter as an elder, bearing stories of loss and love that would either heal old wounds or tear them open wider than ever before. The Thorn family ranch looked smaller than Jed remembered. though the basic structure remained unchanged, the same weathered barn where he and Samuel had played as children, the same creek that had provided water for their grandfather's first modest herd, the same rolling hills that stretched toward distant mountains like a green carpet dotted with grazing cattle. But there were differences too. New buildings suggested prosperity and growth. Fences ran in straight lines across pastures that had once been open range. The main house had been expanded, with a covered porch that wrapped around three sides and spoke of comfort earned through years of careful stewardship. A woman emerged from the house as Jed approached middle-aged, with graying hair and eyes that reminded him startlingly of his mother's gentle expression. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to managing practical affairs, but her face showed wariness at the sight of a rough-dressed stranger approaching from the direction of the high country. "Can I help you?" she called, maintaining a respectful distance while clearly prepared to retreat if necessary. Jed removed his hat, feeling suddenly conscious of his appearance after years of mountain living. "My name is Jedediah Thorn," he said simply. "I believe this ranch once belonged to my family." The woman's expression shifted from wariness to shock, then to something that might have been recognition. "Uncle Jed?" she whispered. "But that's impossible. You disappeared 50 years ago. Everyone said you were dead." "Uncle." The word hit him with unexpected force, suggesting connections and relationships that had continued to grow during his long absence. This woman, his niece, apparently represented family he had never known existed, children and grandchildren who had been born and raised on the ranch while he wandered the mountains in self-imposed exile. "I'm Ellen," she continued, stepping closer with growing excitement. "Ellen Thorn Patterson. My father was your brother Samuel. He told me stories about you when I was little, how you could track anything, how you knew every trail in the mountains, how you left home to follow your conscience. Samuel's daughter." Jed stared at her, seeing echoes of his brother in her features, but also something else, a warmth and openness that spoke of a different kind of upbringing than either he or Samuel had received under their stern father's rule. "But father died when I was 12, Ellen continued, confusion clouding her expression. "He was thrown from a horse during a roundup. Mother raised me and my brothers alone until she remarried. Where have you been all these years? And how did you know father?" The question revealed the magnitude of the story Jed would need to tell. Ellen believed Samuel had died in a ranch accident, had grown up thinking her father was buried in the family cemetery behind the main house. She had no knowledge of the hidden cave, the wife and children Samuel had lost, the decade of solitude that had followed his family's deaths. "There's much I need to tell you about your father," Jed said gently, "much you don't know about the life he lived before you were born. But first, may I ask, is there anyone else? Other family?" Ellen's face brightened. "Oh yes, my brothers, Thomas and James, they run the ranch now. My cousin Sarah and her husband manage the cattle operation. And there are children, the next generation of Thorns, learning to love this land the way we all have." Samuel had found love again, after losing Mary and their children, had rebuilt his life, returned to the ranch, raised another family. The realization struck Jed like lightning. His brother had not died alone in the mountain cave. Somehow, Samuel had found the strength to leave that sanctuary of memories and claim a place among the living once more. Over the following days, as Ellen gathered the scattered family members and Jed shared the artifacts he had carried from the cave, the full story emerged piece by piece. Samuel had indeed lived alone in the mountains for nearly a decade after losing his first family. But in 1862, weakened by illness and loneliness, he had finally made the journey home that Jed had found evidence of in his maps and travel plans. The family had welcomed him back without question, glad to have any surviving member return to help rebuild what war and loss had damaged. Samuel had eventually married a widow named Catherine, had raised Ellen and her brothers with the patient love of a man who understood the preciousness of every moment with family. But Samuel had never forgotten his first family, or the brother he had hoped to reconcile with before death claimed him. In a trunk in the attic, Ellen showed Jed dozens of letters Samuel had written, but never sent messages addressed to Jedediah Thorn, Mountain Country, filled with news of the ranch, updates on family happenings, and constant expressions of hope that his brother would someday return home. The discovery that moved Jed most deeply was an unfinished quilt found in Samuel's room after his death. The pattern was complex, designed to tell the story of the Thorn family through fabric and thread. Squares depicted the original homestead, the mountain peaks where both brothers had found refuge, and symbols representing love, loss, forgiveness, and hope. But the quilt had never been completed. Samuel had died before finishing his textile memoir, leaving the border unfinished and several squares empty of the decorative stitching that would have brought the story to its conclusion. Working together over the following weeks, the family completed Samuel's quilt. Ellen and her sisters-in-law contributed needlework skills, while Jed provided the missing pieces of the story that would inform the final squares. They stitched representations of the cave homestead, of Mary and the children who had died there, of the love that had sustained Samuel through decades of grief and eventual healing. The completed quilt became the centerpiece of the ranch house living room, a visual reminder that the Thorn family story was one of resilience and redemption rather than simple tragedy. Every thread connected past to present, loss to hope, isolation to the profound. Human need for connection and belonging. Jed claimed a room in the house he had left 50 years ago, but he also maintained a small cabin in the foothills where he could retreat when the noise and bustle of family life became overwhelming. He had learned to live in solitude, but he was also learning to live in community, sharing stories with children who hung on every word of his mountain adventures, teaching his nephews the tracking skills that had kept him alive in the wilderness, and slowly, carefully, allowing his heart to expand once more to include the bonds he had thought he'd lost forever. The reunification quilt wrapped around him on cold nights like an embrace from the past and a promise for the future, proof that some stories have endings worth waiting 50 years to discover.